Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University, and I am the director of online peace science, the Online Peace Science Colloquium. So welcome to today's installment. Today we're joined by Caglayan Bashir.
Yes.
Sorry, that was close. Bashir, who is presenting, she's from Loyola University Chicago, and she's presenting a project called The Impact of Women Insurgents on Rebel Group Effectiveness. We're joined by an esteemed panel today who has read and will be sharing comments on Caglayan's paper. We're joined by Reed Wood, Associate Professor of Political Science at Arizona State University, Mia Bloom, Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University.
I'm in communication, but
I'm sorry, Professor of Communications.
I haven't been in the poli-sci department in 15 years.
Oh, I apologize. And Aysegul Aydin, I think I'm close, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Colorado-Boulder. So we'll start with a presentation from Caglayan, and I just want to remind everyone that if they want to see the paper in full, it is posted on the Online Peace Science Colloquium website. It's not? Okay, so if you would like to get a version of this, then you can email Caglayan directly, or you can email us, and we will pass on your request. So that's PSSonlinecolloquia@gmail.com. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Caglayan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. I'm very excited to present my paper today. All of the discussants have influenced my work a lot, so I'm very grateful that you agreed to read my paper, and I'm looking forward to your comments. So I'll share my screen now. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the impacts of women insurgents on rebel group effectiveness. So it has been a very popular issue in the recent years, especially the Western news media had attracted attention to the female fighters, especially with the rise of ISIS. We see a lot of news items about the Kurdish female fighters. However, the studies on whether and how women's participation influences the operation of the armed organizations remains a bit limited in the literature. Now, in recent years, this has changed a bit, but still we lack studies on how women's participation influences the armed organizations' resilience. Also, in the recent years, there have been an increase in the proportion of women in rebel organizations, and the number of organizations that recruit women has also increased. So, for instance, ISIS started deploying women fighters on the front line for the first time in 2018. So, why looking at the impacts of women insurgents on rebel groups is important? First of all, the scholarship on women's involvement in political violence often focuses on the causes of women's participation. So here I focus on the results of their participation, and it clarifies the role women play in the long-term survival of the armed movements instead of their initial mobilization. So this perspective can provide some policy implications that might be useful to decrease overall violence. Governments can adopt specific defensive policies, or the detrimental consequences of women's participation can encourage policymakers to address the elimination of the causes that lead women to take part in the armed movements. Also, women tend to be excluded from the demobilization, disarmament, and reconstruction programs after the conflict because they are considered to take subordinate roles or minor roles. So limited attention to the impacts of women on the conflict processes can also be harmful for the success of these post-conflict programs. Also, the the conclusions of the study highlights the parallels between the role of women in rebel organizations and the economic and political organizations, because in both of these organizations, women are tend to be assigned important roles in times of crisis, a phenomenon called glass cliff. So it is important to see the similarities of how women face barriers in those very different organizations. So in the literature, there seems to be two counter views about women's role on military effectiveness. The first one argues that women have profoundly benefited from women have profoundly benefit the armed organizations. So I will just quickly summarize the mechanisms that are argued in the literature. Women can contribute by doing similar tasks as men. They can increase the fighting capacity of the armed organizations and increase the number of participants by fighting themselves. And there are some group of mechanisms that women can contribute unique advantages. They can be more effective than men. So, for instance, female militants can facilitate arms procurement and access to other resources because they are more likely to evade detection than men due to women's stereotypes as peaceful or compassionate. And women can mobilize further participation through signaling insurgencies' broad support base by conveying a message of gravity of the repression, or by shaming men into fighting, or using social networks that are specific to women, so they can easily communicate with locals, as they can more freely walk through the streets in times of war due to their less dangerous stereotype. And another way is that they can indoctrinate or attract children into the conflict, and they are also seem to be useful in building loyal networks through marriages. However, despite the benefits, there are also costs of women insurgents that are argued in the literature. This is also common for, this idea is also common for state militaries. We see that in the political arguments. The first one is that women are argued to disrupt group bonding. So men tend to oppose female participation, and this can be challenging. It can be challenging for them to fight side by side, as they think women are unfit for the army. And women and men may not focus on the combat duties due to possible intimate relationships. Commanders fear about that. And also there would be higher risk of sexual exploitation, both from the members of the group and from the outsiders. Also, when women are integrated into the army, other men can be discouraged to join the ranks, holding that the organization is not sufficiently masculine, quote unquote, and women's involvement can also reduce public support due to the same stereotypes. And also, women are argued to be not so capable to achieve heavy duties due to their relative physical weakness. So, considering these arguments, it is hard to tell whether overall women benefit or harm organizations. To assess the overall impact of women on rebel group resilience, I use large-N tests as a plausibility probe. So first, I test whether participation of women insurgents, both combatants and non-combatants, increase the resilience of the organizations. And I also look at the impact of only female combatants. So I used Women in Armed Rebellion dataset from Reed Wood and Giacomo Thomas, and thanks Reed for this very useful dataset. It includes information for women recruitment for over 200 organizations. And there are three main independent variables. Female competence is binary. The other one measures the ratio of female combatants in a cadre, and I collected original data building on the Word data set on the female non-combatants. Dependent variable is the rebel strength, defined as rebel groups' ability to resist or evade government repression. And I used ordered probit and also OLS models to assess the hypothesis. And the research design basically compares the group with women and without women. So there are limitations in all observational studies. There are limitations. There can be alternative explanations that explain rebel strength or female participation. So I use control variables for that. But also, more importantly, there can be this reverse causality. We don't know if the direction is from female combatants to rebel strength, but it can be that stronger groups are more likely to recruit women as they can deal with the integration problems easier. And this seems to be the explanation that is more seems to be more accepted in the literature. So this part is difficult to solve, but even if this is the case, I expect a strong correlation. So here is the results, but I have a more user-friendly version of the results. Without control variables, the female combatant and female combatant prevalence.
Caglayan,
yes.
Just so you know, we've not been able to see you advance through your slides, and that's fine because you've been speaking very well and we've been understanding and been able to follow, but we cannot see what results you're showing us.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
You see the results?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. That's
Yeah.
great.
Okay. So these are the results, and when we look at the basic correlation without the control variables, the basic correlation between the female combatants and rebel strength, we don't see significance, like it doesn't achieve the traditionally accepted significance level. However, when we add the control variables, it achieves significance. So we can say that results overall show support for the argument that women militants contribute to the rebel strength, but it isn't very strong, I would say. So in order to explore the mechanisms and conditions of how women impact rebel group resilience, and in order to untangle this causal direction, I used a single case study of the Kurdistan Workers' Party operating in Turkey, the PKK. It's the pioneer of the Kurdish armed movement, and it survived for more than 3 decades and use different strategies over time, and it provides a rich case to explore the diverse ways for the use of women at different organizational strength levels. I used the archives of Servebun, PKK's monthly bulletin from 1982 to 2015. Just to summarize why this studying this case is important. First, it provides a more nuanced understanding of the mechanisms that exist in the literature, and it reveals additional mechanisms that have not attracted more attention in the literature. Also, the conclusion, the study suggests that women are most useful to the organization at times of crisis. Also, it provides an important implication for the interpretation of the statistical analysis. So we will talk about this in a second. So I'll pass elaborating the existing mechanisms because of the time limitation.
Yeah, we've got about 3 minutes, just so you know.
Oh, okay. And I move to the novel mechanisms. it seems that women in the PKK contributes to the tactical diversity of the organization. So women help the organization adopt suicide attacks when guerrilla war was no longer feasible, because they can inflict more costs to the state. And also when the other tactics were no longer useful, women enable the organization switch to the civil resistance tactics, as they can as they help the organization help repair its reputation due to their more moderate view image. Also, women have acted as the coup-proofing strategy. Factions that try to gain the support of women to take over the leadership after the capture of the leader. And however, women have provided strong support for the leadership, since the leader have been very influential in organizing this women's movement in the organization. Women have proved their loyalty, and they protected the leadership against the internal factions that were trying to take over the leadership. The other aspect of women's contribution is that they were very influential in building international networks by positioning the organization as the supporter of women's rights. And Kurdish female militants' international appeal has expanded even more after the rise of ISIS. So, for instance, here you see the French president giving a reception in his palace for Nesrin Abdullah, the leader of the women protection units in Syria, the offshoot of PKK. There were also costs of women participation that exist in the literature. Disruption of group cohesion is the most important part that women's integration bring to the organization. I'll pass these ones quickly. The opposition from male members and the regulation of intimate relationships has been the two important points explaining the costs of women's participation. So when we come to the conditions, the study shows that the two main mechanisms that explain women's impacts on the operation of the armed group are the stereotypes that associate women with pacifism and moderation, and gender inequality, and the lower life prospects of women insurgents outside of the organization, which lead them to have strong loyal ties. So the underlying mechanisms are these two main mechanisms explaining most of the impacts of women. So we can argue that women insurgents would be more effective at settings where gender stereotypes are stronger, and when women face higher gender inequality. And ironically, these are the same factors that explain why rebel groups consider using women mostly at times of crisis, but not throughout the whole armed resistance. The important point that I'd like to attract your attention is the direction of causality. So the case study argues that women insurgents are most useful at times of crisis. They get more important roles. They get key roles at times of crisis. So it suggests a selection effect for the large N studies. So it seems that weaker organizations would be more likely to resort to female recruitment. Hence, the estimates of the large N study would be biased downward. So it suggests that women have a positive impact on the group's strength despite this bias. And as for the conclusion, I'll just want to note that more often than not, women do not constitute a homogeneous category, and the further research should consider the different backgrounds and pathways through which women have participated in the rebellions. So benefits and costs of women can differ under this different conditions. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation despite the technical problems. But now I will stop sharing the screen then.
Sounds great. And let's turn it over to Aysegul to get us started.
Well, I think you already scooped my argument in your discussion slides, but I'm going to say it anyway. So two things about, whether the data is helping you to make the argument that you're trying to make. So you mentioned that you coded data on non-combatant,
Yes.
female non-combatants. So so I would very much like to see examples of narratives that you based that coding on. So what exactly was the narrative saying so that you concluded that this is a non-combatant kind of function in the insurgent organization? So and you don't describe that data as much as I would like you to describe it. There's just one paragraph in the research design, and there's not anything else. So obviously there's a lot of effort that goes into expanding Reed's data, because I think that's exclusively combatant roles. So I would like to see what you mean by the non-combatant role. And one more thing, I think your data is cross-sectional. So there's no time dimension in it. So these
That's
are the
right.
units are insurgent organizations. So just going back to the very final point that you made, which is, which one leads to what is the direction of causality here? So stronger organizations are more likely to attract females, or the rebel strength variable, the dependent variable that you're using here, rebel strength. I mean, it's a function of numbers, right? It's
Yes.
by description, it's a function of numbers. So maybe that is also already integrated in the rebel strength variable. So you're not really, this is not a causal relationship. It's already built into the dependent variable. Maybe, I don't know, because, there's no time dimension. So you can't just say, so in this year, there are more female combatants, and the next year, there's a greater rebel strength. Since that's not there, it's not clear what's going on here. If this is causal, or if this is a matter of the description, operationalization of the rebel strength variable that you're finding a relationship in between. So I'll stop there so that others can chime in.
Caglayan, do you want to
Thank you.
respond really quickly?
Yes, thank you very much for the comments. Yes, the problem with the large N analysis, the statistical analysis, is that the data does not have the time component. So that's why I try to use it only as a plausibility probe, and I try to untangle the causal relationship with the case study. But yes, that's the one problem of the data. Yes, it doesn't have time components, just cross-sectional.
And no more description on the non-combatant roles,
Yes.
please, when you're rewriting.
Yes, I try to add some description in the appendix, but yeah, I will provide more information of how I coded them.
All right, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Let me start by saying I really enjoyed the paper. It's and I appreciate your efforts to expand the data set. So I guess my comment in some ways leads on from Aysegul's, which is the dependent variable. I'm unsure how it really matches the hypotheses that you make. So I guess there are two parts to this comment. First, the connection between the argument and the hypotheses, I think, could be made slightly clearer. it would be helpful to more clearly elaborate on how tactical diversity, resource mobilization, appeals to the population, connections to local constituencies, and these other factors that you mentioned actually lead to resilience. You have some kind of brief comments about how those factors help groups survive and maybe achieve their goals, but I think you could bring those together and kind of discuss the ways in which they complement one another and how, as a total package, they increase the group's ability to survive and endure and overcome the challenges that they face in the asymmetric conflict context in which most of these actors are operating. And then from there, though, since you specifically identify resilience in the hypotheses, I was a little confused as to why rebel strength was the outcome of interest. It seemed to me that it might make more sense to look at something like duration, or if there's a way to set up, explicitly analyzing whether rebel groups with female combatants and non-combatants are able to survive through periods of extreme adversity, which I think is in many ways at core in your argument. Although I think, again, if you kind of clarify the ways in which those specific mechanisms or components you mentioned, help them survive or achieve those goals, that then you'd have a clearer sense of what data would be useful for your dependent variable. It was just the dependent variable struck me as kind of not at odds with, but not a exact fit for the hypothesis that you present.
Mia, you had a comment on this?
Yeah, on this particular point that Reed just made, I didn't get a sense that you had a definition of resilience. So the problem is, because I don't know if it's about longevity or if it's about the ability to withstand government incursions, assaults, penetration, especially you're dealing in particular with your one case of a group that's been around for a long time, but it has this ebb and flow, these periods of hibernation when it goes underground. Sometimes it changes its name, or sometimes it reemerges, ostensibly as something else. So that, even coding that, and this goes to the first comment, temporally, I think it would be really important to show over time how you're measuring either strength or resilience or capability. And I have a whole bunch of other questions, but I really wanted to lead with that one, in part because I think that, again, as a non-quant person, that's going to be very important that your variables match up with the quantitative analysis that you're showing. And I wasn't sure, Emily, how much more comments do you want me to give? Or do you
Why don't you hang on and I'll have her respond, and then I'll come back to you for your next point.
Thank you for the comments. I know there is a problem with the dependent variable, but so for the duration or the survivability of the organization, the indigeneity problem would be also an important problem. So I kind of decided to look at the rebel strength, and that was the available data. It is not ideal, but if you have any suggestions on how to overcome this, I would love to hear that. But you are right. Thank you for the comment. I need to explain what is meant by resilience or strength. I'll need to explain it better. Yeah.
Reed, you have two fingers on
One thing you could maybe do is, if you're looking at strength, you can look at, depending if you can get this data, battle deaths or troop movements, or, I don't know if this data exists. I have data up until 2016 on PKK's, all the PKK's information that they've put out on their website about the number of women. But it doesn't necessarily show a percentage, because you led with PKK, or just in general, that you're seeing an upward tick as far as women's participation. But women's participation historically, when you look at Weinberg's work from 20, 30 years ago, is always about 30%. And so based on your statistics, it looks like it's about 30%. And if it's 30%, then women's participation in violent groups can be lower than 30%, but it tends to be around 30%, which would undermine one of your preliminary statements about that there's been an increase of women over time.
Reed, you had 2 fingers on that?
Well, as a potential solution to, I guess, the problem that I the potential dilemma that I brought up is I would be perhaps more comfortable if you used the term other than resilience, and you I think strength could work, or there may be other measures. The NSA data set that you get your strength measure from has a fighting capacity variable as well. And it seems to me that a lot of your arguments really focus on the ability of the group to shift tactics during times of stress, and that's what allows them to survive. And so I think the tactical diversity component, which several of your other mechanisms actually kind of fall within or fall under the umbrella of. So I don't know that you necessarily need to see tactical diversity as different from some of the other components. But if you kind of package them all together, what that suggests to me is that resilience might be just the ability of the group to shift tactics or strategies at specific time periods. And you can't test the time dimension, but maybe if you explain it more in that way, and just don't use the term resilience, but think of it. I can't think of a term that would be appropriate, but then maybe, something related to the strength or the fighting ability of the group might make more sense. But the measure that you're using is really one of military capacity, it seems to me. And so that just doesn't seem to fit. So, but as a first cut, I would say that just not using the term resilience would make me would put me a little more at ease.
Okay, thank you.
Why don't we get Aysegul in here, because you have to leave a little bit early, if that's okay with everyone. Do you have another thought?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, well, maybe I should say something about the PKK case, since I have a book on PKK, so I was hoping that I can say something that's intelligent here. So I think, and going back to the rebel strength dependent variable, again, most of the argument here is about tactical diversity. So one way to change the dependent variable is to look at the tactics that insurgent organizations adopt over time. And this is just going to like a bigger data set, like terrorism data set, and see what kind of, what is the repertoire of these insurgent organizations that you include in the analysis. And that's one way to look at the dependent variable, and that's a more direct test of the argument that you're trying to make here. Obviously, that's more data effort, but that's a much more direct test. And if you look at the analysis results, you're not getting much juice out of the rebel strength variable, because most of them are insignificant. And when you add control variables, it becomes a little significant. Yeah. But that will make people a little anxious when they read the the statistical analysis part. Why is this happening? The control variables are playing a trick here that you have no control over, and that's going to make people a little anxious. So I would like to I would try to change the rebel strength variable to something else. But about the PKK case, I think it's a good case to test the mechanism that females play really important non-combatant roles. You mentioned civil resistance. Yeah, that was, one of the really big things in late 1980s and early 1990s. So yeah, it's a good case to illustrate non-combatant roles. But I was wondering if it's a good case to show whether women are effective on the battlefield. Obviously they do lots of things. They're very central to the organization. And the PKK was pretty adamant in creating these branches directly targeting women. So it is a fantastic case to show all of that. But there's not a lot of written on whether combat units or teams, including women, and how they did on the battlefield, how effective they were, or were they ever sent to battle in the first place? Or was this like a symbolic integration of women into combat units and just to empower them in the organization? So I don't have the answers to these questions. I haven't read a lot about this. And I don't think people wrote a lot about this in the first place. So, but I appreciate your effort to go back to Serhebon. I think that's a very good source here. It's not something that people have done a lot. Going back to insurgent publications and trying to get a sense of what they're trying to do. So that's really good effort. Thank you for doing that. But I would like you to think about, how whether females were effective or they actually fought in battles in the PKK case. I'll stop there.
Thank
Talia?
you. Yeah, I can elaborate more on that in the paper. I think there are a lot to say because women tend to get like combatant roles, and they even become commanders in a lot of cases. So yeah, in the paper I can elaborate more on that and give maybe some numbers of how many of them were commanders or how many of them were combatants. So yeah, thank you. But they have been very influential, and this, yeah, we see that because they have this commander roles as well. So I can talk about that in detail in the paper, more in detail.
Reid?
Yeah, on a point that Aysegul made about the women in kind of protest or nonviolent civil resistance, I agree that that was a really cool point that I think you could do a lot more with, because that's a lot of tactical diversity for a rebel group. And you could, there may not be space in this paper, or it may be, if you highlight that more, you'll have to sacrifice other elements. But it made me think of a lot of the work on the way armed groups alternate between violent and nonviolent responses. So some of Will Moore's work on protest and dissent dynamics. And this seemed like a really neat case that you could explore that in, and particularly explore the role that women play in that. So I agree with Aysegul that you could play that up a lot more, and the contribution is potentially pretty significant there. But on that note, one of the questions that I had was, are those women who are formal members of the PKK, because there are female members who are combatants, there are female members who are non-combatants, and then there's a group of women who are often just affiliated with the group or maybe allied with the group. And so, conceptualizing how you think about these different roles and exactly how women fit into them, I think would be very useful, because it wasn't clear to me from at least your description that the women who were protesting were actually PKK members, or they're just women who are kind of allied with the movement and maybe operating in the political wing. But you could draw those distinctions a little more clearly in the paper, and I think get a lot more traction from that argument if you can kind of define that spectrum of participation.
I wanted to quickly thank Aysegul for joining us. She has to take off a little bit early, but we're going to keep on going.
Everyone.
But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aysegul. Thank you.
Caglayan, or should we turn it over to Mia?
Okay, so I have a few things, and I was just went through it systematically because I wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to speak. I think in terms of the issues that you raised with the general benefits to having women in the insurgent groups, I think that you don't really sort of explore one element that I've explored, which is the ability of women to penetrate either not just when men cannot, because I think you had a substitute effect that you mentioned with battle losses, there was an increase in recruitment of women. But I think it's also that when the target changes from hard targets to soft targets and a focus on the civilian populations, the women blend in much better than the men. And so I don't think it's just about goading men into action. And I think that you even start to raise it when you mention the story of the Kurdish bride who's able to evade detection because, you know, she pretends to be a bride and the men can't see her. This is, again, very similar to the reasons women are used, because either they're not checked at the checkpoints or they're checked especially invasively, and that causes outrage to the community. One element you also didn't raise, which I think in terms of the utility aspect, is the media effects in the work that I've done and the work that Maura Conway in Ireland has done, looking at the publicity effect of using women, that the women get 8 times more publicity than when it's men. Just a few correctives. You raised the issue of IRA and women. Actually, when I did my field research for Bombshell with the IRA, the men actually didn't want the women involved. And so, especially with things like the hunger strikes. And so it's actually the reason why when Bobby Sands went on hunger strike, there's 8 of them at the same time who died. Women also in Arma prison went on the hunger strike, and they were told to stop the hunger strike. And then going back to, I apologize for jumping back and forth because I was taking notes. In the PKK case study, when you talk about the pregnancy bomb, I think from 1996, that's precisely why the women have a leg over the men, because men can't pretend to be pregnant. And I thought it would be an opportunity here for you to mention how this tactic was then diffused or replicated by other groups. For example, when the PKK did it in 96, Palestinian groups started doing it in 2004. And then I think this follows from Jem's first comment. You talk about how men opposed women, but I would have liked to see a few more statements or either comments from interviews where the men explain why. And so the last thing, last 2 things I wanted to say, with regard to banning relationships, might be worth mentioning that both the LTT and the FARC also did the same thing in terms of banning relationships. And I don't know if this was more about operational discipline, but it also contradicts somewhat what you were saying earlier, your quote from Mazarana about the presence of women increases exploitation. So I'm wondering if that's the reason why you don't have the romantic relationships, that in fact, it's either operational discipline or it's ultimately to protect the women. And then the final point is you mentioned left-wing ideology, but I think the caveat to that is only if the left-wing ideology encapsulates some sort of addressing of women's equality in their political platform. And I'll tell you why. I'm trying to remember the name of the American groups. Not the Black Panthers, but so the Weathermen. Both the Panthers and the Weathermen would be considered left-wing groups, and neither of them particularly held women in great esteem. And so I think that it's not just the left-wing ideology, but it's the conjunctural effect of left-wing ideology with a political platform that addresses societal inequalities directed against women. And I'll shut up because I wanted to give you the whole list. I can also email you my notes, if that helps.
That would be great. Yes, I would love to see that.
And I sent everyone a note. It seems like they caught the bomber, so we have good.
Oh, really? Okay.
And his white truck is covered in Trump stickers. Not a hoax. Well, hopefully it's not.
Caglayan, do you want to respond to any of that?
These are very useful comments. Thank you so much. I will look into LTTE and FARC in terms of banning relationships, and I don't have much to add. Thank you so much. These are very useful.
Reed, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have a couple more suggestions on the. I don't have a page number listed, but you have a discussion about the PKK use of appeals that helped make and how women helped make the group more, I guess, legitimate to the relevant audience and increase the support from the domestic community. But it seemed like in the description that most of the the references that you used were more from the PKK's own materials, saying this is how we expected women to benefit us, which is really useful because that shows the group's kind of strategic logic, but it doesn't actually show that that happened, right? You don't really have any evidence, qualitative or otherwise, that says that by doing that, the population responded in the way the group expected. And that's really more what you need to make your argument about it, you know, about group resilience or group strength. So I think if you could find some examples of how the community responded positively, that would probably help your argument along.
Charlene?
Yes, thank you for the comment. I can give more examples of how the community responded. It has been influential in mobilizing the women in Turkey or approaching to the like the larger audiences, like Turkish audiences that were not immediately in their immediate constituency. So that's a good point. The study mostly relies on PKK's archives, but I am also planning to add more stuff from the perspective of the public, how they responded, or from the perspective of the states as well. Thank you.
Ron, one thing and again, I apologize just because you didn't put it in the paper, but you had it in your verbal presentation. There is not good evidence that ISIS has been using women on the front lines. And in fact, so it's been part of a debate between me and Simon Caughey and Deborah Margolin and Charlie Winter in the UK. And then there was a UN report by Nellie Lahoud, which basically substantiated, you know, the only thing we have, as you mentioned, that they started using them in 2018. The only thing we have is the one video of the woman in a burqa shooting a, by the way, Reed's in Arizona, so maybe he knows as well as most people. That's not how you shoot a gun. You don't shoot over your head. You don't do anything. Plus, the person in a burqa could have been a woman, maybe a man. But in other words, because my other hat is being inside ISIS's encrypted network, and I see everything that they say and everything that they post. And then my student who's Turkish, Aisha, is on all the Turkish networks. They haven't mentioned a woman once. And so I would just as a verbal thing, as you're saying it, just you're inadvertently opening up a can of worms that you don't need to. Just go right in to what you're talking about, which is fascinating enough without linking it to ISIS. Except, and going back to the point that I was making about the media effects, Orash Sezikli has written some, I think they're just articles or chapters in edited volumes about sort of the this media effect of these beautiful YPG women, and that they're poster girls, and that there's this emphasis on their attractiveness and how they look, and so that there is something to be said about the way in which the women of the YPG have been at least portrayed. So that I think that the media effect isn't just getting more propaganda stories, but they've fetishized these very attractive young women. I also, if you want, just because I have all this, I have a bunch of the images of the women that because I didn't get to see the full presentation, which you may or may not want, and I've already sent you the notes.
Yeah, thank you so much. This would be very helpful. Yeah, I talk about media's effect in as like receiving popularity or appeal to international audience. But yeah, the media obviously increase their visibility and fetishize, as you mentioned. So this can be also another aspect that it might not contribute to the military capability or the strength, as now I talk about in the paper, but it also increases their popularity, or might end up attracting more positive public opinion, at least. Yes.
I just posted a citation in the chat that actually addresses Mia's point that might be helpful for you.
And by the way, before you sign off, this group chat has tons of resources and links and suggestions that our panelists have been making as we've been talking. So you should definitely check it out.
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much.
We're going to wrap up fairly soon, but if you guys have, do either of you have last points you'd like to make?
I have a couple minor points, but I can.
No, go ahead.
So the control variables in the quantitative analysis, I thought were a little. There are a couple missing, and a couple I thought you could exclude. The conflict intensity variable seemed a little odd to me, because I would expect the direction of causality to go the other way, that stronger groups produce more battlefield deaths rather than battlefield deaths producing stronger groups. So that might really be working against your results. And then I think given some of the other aspects of your argument, it would be really useful to include measures of external support. And you also might want to more explicitly consider whether the presence of female combatants actually leads to external support. So and kind of a broader point about the quantitative analysis, though, I think that the way you're making your argument doesn't necessarily imply a direct relationship between female combatants and group strength or resilience, but female combatants may be a factor that increases the likelihood of observing things like greater mobilization or greater resource mobilization or support from the external community, and it may be from external constituencies, and so it may be those things that are actually driving group survival, resilience, or strength. So, I think you're putting a lot of work on the female combatants variable to say that they have a direct relationship to strength as much as they're part of a kind of multi-step causal story. Now, modeling that is very difficult, but
yeah, no, I have another paper in that looks at the support that women insurgents get, like group with women insurgents get. So in my working paper, I deal with the external support part more in detail. Yeah, I can maybe incorporate some of the aspects that I found from that paper and mention it here in more detail, maybe.
Great. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. Thank you, Caglayan, for sharing your work with us. And thank you to Reed and Mia, and also Aysegul, for taking the time to read the paper and joining us this morning and giving excellent comments. So I should remind everyone to keep an eye out for the next one, which will be not in 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks is peace science. And then it's the week after that.
Science this year.
It's in Austin.
Oh, guys, you're going to have the greatest time.
It's going to be the best.
Thank you so much for the comments. They are very useful, and I will definitely check the links and articles that you send. And if you can send your comments, if you have, that would be even greater. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great.
Well, it was nice meeting everyone.
Really enjoyed the paper.
Nice to meet you.
And thank you, Emily, for coordinating.
Yeah, it's my pleasure all the time.
Yes, thank you so much.
Well.
Thanks.
Nice seeing you, Mia.